So UCL has recently relinquished an honour or an accolade, but it's the kind of honour that we're rather happy to relinquish, actually. It's that of having been the home of the biggest fraud in the history of the subject. Previously, of course, most people would agree would have been Cyril Burt, one of my predecessors here as head of department. And it's quite interesting to think about the Burt case. I mean, without going into great detail about it, many of you will, I'm sure, know more than me about it, but you can think of one or two of the salient features of the Burt scandal. I mean, first of all, it's all based on circumstantial evidence. I mean, even to this day, there are people who will dispute whether Burt ever did anything wrong. He was accused after his death of manipulating some of the data from twins that he published in relation to their concordance for intelligence. Even if he did do that, it was on a modest scale in the sense that there were only a handful of publications that were affected. And lastly, although of course we would never condone that kind of fraud, I mean it is fraud if that's what he did, there was a sense in which what he did was benign because it was all in the service of coming up with an estimate of the heritability of intelligence. And it turns out that his estimate is completely in tune with all subsequent estimates, virtually. So now we fast forward to this individual and the institutions to whom we have relinquished this accolade. The three universities where Dietrich Stapel was employed during his professional career. And think again about Burt. So Stapel is responsible for at least 55 journal papers, which are all now being retracted on that huge scale. This is not circumstantial, this is factual, because to his credit, Stapel has actually assisted with the inquiry that was carried out and has, fessed up to the to the fraud and has explained how he did the fraud, which is pretty jaw-dropping. And I'd encourage everybody to go and read the report because its description of how the methods that he used is quite extraordinary. But also, this fraud is rather malign in the sense that Stapel published evidence which has changed theorizing in a lot of ways in social psychology, and the field is going to have to undo a lot of the views that it reached on the basis of his work, because the vast majority of those effects are not real effects, and they have made their way into the literature and influenced people's thinking, and it's very difficult to undo the harmful effects of those. I said that Stapel had actually cooperated with the inquiry. He's cooperated to the extent that he's actually written now an autobiography of his career as a fraud. I think this is probably, I haven't read this because it's only in Dutch at the moment. This is, I think, out of the Lance Armstrong School of Confession. It's the system's fault for not picking up on what I was doing and for not scrutinizing my work more closely. I don't know if there are probably some Dutch speakers in the room, but the title of this autobiography is kind of interesting, at least if it translates accurately. It's called Derailed. And, to my mind, that gives the impression of an external cause of something derailing. A train is derailed because something external, the rails, are broken, not an internal cause. And that, I believe, is one of the sort of themes of the book. Something else that's worth noting is that there have been, by all accounts, allegations that the book contains instances of plagiarism. You couldn't make it up. But of course, this is all serious. This is all very serious. And it's not so much, and this talk isn't so much about fraud per se, it's about the wider context and the wider set of issues that are being prompted in part by these very, very prominent cases of manifest fraud. This is extraordinarily bad news for our field. We are regularly now getting tarred with the brush. And in the media, psychology is being presented as a flaky subject in which the researchers are employing indefensible practices. I'll just show you a couple of examples. These are pulled off the web, but this was actually a front page article on the print edition of The Guardian. So, you know, the great and the good of the UK were reading about this over their cornflakes. This is fraud in science. Don't worry, you can't read this, but it's fraud in science. But, you know, fraud and misconduct are threatening scientific research, and the whole article is about psychology. Right. In America, similarly, this was, again, an article in the print edition of the New York Times. Fraud case seen as red flag for psychology research. How is this playing out in you know, grant awarding bodies where psychologists and economists and social scientists and so on are sitting around the table thinking about how to allocate their funding? What is this doing for the views that our colleagues in other fields have of the worth of our research? I'll just read a couple of bits from this New York Times article. It says, a well-known psychologist falsified data and made up in entire experiments. An investigating committee has found experts say the case exposes deep flaws in the way science is done in a field, psychology, that has only recently earned a fragile respectability. The scandal, involving about a decade of work, is the latest in a string of embarrassments in a field that critics and statisticians say badly needs to overhaul how it treats research results. In recent years, psychologists have reported a raft of findings on race biases, brain imaging, and even extrasensory perception that have not stood up to scrutiny. Now, this is taking us, of course, into this wider set of issues about the field, and it is a wide set of issues, and I hope that'll become clearer perhaps a bit later in the talk. But nowhere has this set of issues come under closer scrutiny than in an area that has come, perhaps slightly unfortunately, to be called the social priming field. It's not a particularly adequate term. I mean, one sense in which this is a very unfortunate term is because priming as a general phenomenon has a history that goes back decades and is an extraordinarily well-established phenomenon in its own right. But social priming refers to a whole series of kind of demonstrations which all have a kind of common underlying theme of people's behavior being subtly influenced by environmental cues of which they're unconscious or whose influence they're unaware of. And it has emerged that some of these studies, perhaps many of them, which have been highly picked up in the literature and been the subject of enormous amounts of debate, may not be robust effects. So the most famous one of these, the original one, John Barge's walking speed experiment, which many of you will know about. This has been cited well over 1,000 times in the literature. It's an incredibly influential study. What Barge did in this experiment was to ask participants, students, to solve a whole bunch of anagrams. And the solutions of the anagrams were words that were generally associated with the concept of old age. And as far as they were concerned, they completed those anagrams and they finished the experiment. But then the real part of the experiment began because as they walked out of the lab, the time it took them to walk down the corridor was measured. And the claim that Barge and colleagues published was that having this concept of old age very subtly activated by solving a bunch of anagrams had an effect on the speed with which people walked down the corridor. It slowed them down, a subtle priming effect on their behavior. I won't go through all of these, but you can see that they have a sort of common theme to them of this subtle influence on behavior, like priming people with the concept of money in some more or less subtle way causes participants to prefer to play alone, work alone, put more physical distance between themselves and an acquaintance, and so on. At least two of these studies, the which ones? The one at the bottom here and the Zhong and Lilliquist one were published in the journal Science, which is probably the most prestigious science publication in the world, incredibly difficult to get into, but which has been somewhat open to publishing these kinds of eye-catching studies. Well, last year, a researcher called Stefan Doyen published a failure to replicate Barger's study. Stefan actually visited here. He gave a talk on his experiments before they were published. Very scholarly individual, had taken considerable care to do these experiments, but hadn't been able to publish them. Hadn't been able to replicate the effects. That prompted from John Barge a quite extraordinary reaction in an online blog that he does. He accused Doyen and his colleagues of really being incompetent researchers. I think I'm right in saying that he's now pulled down this blog. This is meant to depict toys being thrown out of a pram. And this is interesting also because this is another blog reporting on all of this study. And this is written by Ed Yong, who's a journalist who has written many pieces about this, this growing controversy and has himself been the subject of quite a few attacks. So things were looking really quite dismal in the autumn of last year as people were beginning to wonder about the reliability of these sorts of effects. My favourite one, by the way, I've only just come across recently. Touching a teddy bear makes lonely people more sociable. And in the autumn, as I expect many of you know, there was then circulated an open letter by Danny Kahneman. Now, Kahneman, of course, is a Nobel laureate. Somebody in that position tends to command attention when they circulate quite broadly an open letter calling on us to get our house in order. And I think one of his motivations for doing this was worry about this external perception of our field and the damage that this is doing. And Kahneman made some strong comments. He said, your field, this is referring to the people doing the social priming research, is now the poster child for doubts about the integrity of psychological research. Your problem is not with the few people who have actively challenged the validity of some priming results. It's with the much larger population of colleagues who in the past accepted your surprising results as facts when they were published. These people have now attached a question mark to the field, and it's your responsibility to remove it. Kahneman can see a train wreck looming. I expect the first victims to be young people on the job market, and the second victims to be people probably applying for grants. Here's Ed Yong's piece in Nature commenting on Kahneman's open letter. Again, don't worry about this. There's just one bit of this that I want to read to you. It says, Kahneman, a psychologist at Princeton University in New Jersey, addressed his open email to researchers who work on social priming, the study of how subtle cues can unconsciously influence our thoughts or behavior. For example, volunteers might walk more slowly down a corridor, which is the Barge study, after seeing words related to old age, or fare better in general knowledge tests after writing down the attributes of a typical professor. And it's at that point that I sort of come into the story in some small way, because for the last 5 or 6 years, I have been trying to look at this particular example that was just referred to in that piece. And what I'm going to do now is to spend a few minutes telling you about some of our studies where we tried to replicate and look at this particular social priming effect. And what we've done as a consequence of the findings that we've obtained. So I should say at this point, this is something that I got into really as a hobby, and all the research that I'm going to tell you about is based on master's and undergraduate student projects. And the incredibly bright and dedicated students who did those projects, you know, they deserve all the credit for the actual experiments that I'm going to tell you about. I should also say that most of those students went into these projects with some predisposition that they would get unconscious priming effects. You know, typical students kind of quite like this sort of stuff, and I think most of them felt inclined to get the effects. So the study goes back to this article by Dijksterhuis and van Nippenburg, published in 1998 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It was an extremely prestigious journal and very difficult to get into. And the priming influence is really incredibly simple. It's this. So in the first part of the experiment, participants are asked to list, they just have a blank piece of paper in front of them. They're asked to list the appearance, lifestyle, and behavior of a typical professor, and other subjects do the same for a typical soccer hooligan. And they spend a few minutes writing down some thoughts that come to mind about professors and soccer hooligans. And then they go into the next part of the experiment, which is often presented as being an unrelated experiment with a sort of, you know, different cover sheet and instructions saying something that's meant to divert awareness of any connection between the two phases. And this is simple. They answer some general knowledge questions, some multiple choice questions like, what's Europe's longest river? The Danube, the Volga, or the Dnieper? And this is what the sort of finding that Dijksterhuis and van Nippenburg reported. These are the percentages of questions answered correctly. And when primed by the concept of professor, participants got about 55% of the questions correct. And when primed with the concept of soccer hooligan, they got 42% correct. And Dijksterhuis and van Nippenburg also got the same effect when they primed the trait. That's to say, they just asked people now to write down, different people, write down everything that they associated with the concept of intelligence, or everything that they thought of associated with the concept of stupidity, the traits. They got exactly the same pattern. But it's really the stereotypes that people have focused mostly on. So again, this falls within that general framework of social priming effects, that it's meant to be a subtle influence on behavior. Dijksterhuis and van Nippenburg argued that their participants were unaware of this influence of the first stage of the experiment on their later performance. And that was actually the bit of this that particularly intrigued me. That's why I got interested in these experiments, because I was not terribly convinced by the ways in which they evaluated participants' awareness. But be that as it may, we decided to have a few goes at replicating this effect. And as I guess is often the case, when you are intrigued by some published research, you often start out changing it a little bit, thinking that maybe you can sort of generalize the method or improve the method even a little bit in your first attempt. So we did experiments in which, well, we thought that general knowledge questions were a bit funny here. I mean, general knowledge question, you either kind of know the answer or you don't. There's not a great deal of scope for continuous variation in measured performance. So we thought that actually using proper IQ test items might be a little bit more revealing, and so we gave participants items from Raven's matrices. We gave participants some items before the prime induction and other different matrices after the prime induction, so that on a participant by participant basis, we had a kind of baseline measure of their performance in order to look at the consequences of the positive or the negative prime. We also used a somewhat extended priming manipulation, which we thought would be, if anything, stronger than the one that Dijksterhuis and van Nippenburg used. So the students pulled some videos off YouTube. One of the videos, for example, is a kind of science program with a whole bunch of boffins talking about cosmology. And another video was a sort of documentary, a few minutes from a documentary about soccer hooligans. Then we asked participants to do the attribute listing bit, and then they did the post test of performance. In the second experiment, we changed a little bit. We got rid of the videos. So now this is similar in terms of the attribute part of this. The priming part of it is the same as in Dijksterhuis and van Nippenburg's experiment. List the attributes of a typical professor or soccer hooligan. And then in 2 further experiments, we then went right back to the original Dijksterhuis and van Nippenburg procedure with general knowledge questions and exactly the same prime manipulation that they used. Okay. So these are very simple experiments. And I mean, I won't dwell for long on the results because really there aren't any. I mean, there's no hint of any effects in any of these experiments. For these first couple of experiments, what we're showing here is change in performance on the Raven's matrices. These numbers are positive, meaning that everybody scores more on the second set of questions than on the first. There's a little bit of a kind of warm-up or practice effect on solving these Raven's matrices. But in both of these cases, in fact, the improvement is slightly greater for the hooligan prime than for the professor prime. And then here are the 2 experiments where we tried to do the effect using the original methods. In both of these, the effect is now in the right direction, but you can see it's absolutely minuscule. Nowhere near significant. And I should say that what's shown here as experiment 4 was actually, I think, pretty much the last experiment that we did in this quite big series, where we thought we were going to go back and have one last go at getting this original effect. This experiment was actually done in Sydney. It wasn't done here. It was done in Ben Newell's lab in Sydney. We created the methods and the protocol from scratch all over again. We went right back to the original paper, made sure we did everything as carefully as we could. We had a new set of general knowledge questions and so on and so forth. And I should say, importantly here also, there's quite a large sample size here. This is considerably larger than in any of the published experiments that Dijksterhuis did. Right, so I suspect that many people in this room have tried replicating some interesting result, and maybe it doesn't pan out, and you get to some point like this. And commonly what you think is, well, life's too short, that's going into the filing cabinet, we'll move on to something else. But having invested quite a lot of time and effort into this, for better or worse, we decided to plow on. And I guess at around this point, we then embarked on a proper literature review to identify all the articles that have been published using this original technique of Dijksterhuis and van Nippenburg's, or very small variations on that. And as you can see, we came up with quite a long list. There's a lot of studies here. And it doesn't seem very plausible that, that all of these are reporting false positives. But the list, when you think about it, the list isn't quite as long as it might at first sight look. I mean, to begin with, here's a name that might look familiar. So Dirk Stapel is the author of one of these papers, and that has been retracted. So that really can't be given any evidential weight. Incidentally, we did replicate this. We replicated it before it was retracted. which is rather embarrassing. Here's another one. Now, some of you will know that Smeesters is also a researcher who's recently been accused of fabricating data, and has the papers have been retracted. So, and this is just an amazing paper. This is about how you do the experiment now. The only difference in this experiment is that for one group of subjects, the materials in the initial prime phase, where a bit of paper where you write down the traits of a professor or a soccer hooligan. In one case, it's in a red folder, and in the other case, it's in a blue folder. And when it's in, if I remember rightly, a blue folder, you get the pattern that Dijksterhuis and Van Nippenburg reported. When it's in a red folder, you get a complete flip over of the results. And they presented in their introduction a sort of well-argued account of why you would predict that. But if you had drawn the graph by hand, you couldn't have got a more perfect dissociation between those results. But that's been retracted, and it seems extremely unlikely that that's a real result. So some of these others also kind of don't add a great deal evidentially. So for instance, there's a paper here, a slightly later paper by Dijksterhuis and Van Nippenburg, and it's got two experiments in it. One experiment is exactly the same as the one that they published previously, showing a priming effect, exactly the priming effect that we weren't able to replicate. Then it has a second experiment in which the participants do the same thing, but when they're sitting in front of a mirror. And Dijksterhuis and Van Nippenburg report that the effect goes away when you're in front of a mirror. Now, of course, so that's not adding any more evidence about the effect. It's showing that under certain circumstances you don't get the effect. So when you look at all this, you pull out a few studies which have got quite persuasive illustrations of the original effect and how it can be moderated in some interesting way by an independent manipulation. And more or less, we have tried to replicate all of these. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to show you one example of the sort of thing that has been done and our efforts to follow up on this. So this is a 2004 study published in Social Cognition by Leboeuf and Estes. And their way of doing the experiment was as follows. They highlighted perfectly reasonably the fact that the subject's sort of connection to a professor or a soccer hooligan would be an important feature of getting this kind of priming effect. So if you identify with a professor, you might expect to get a different consequence from the prime than if you think of yourself as totally different from a professor. All right. So they got some subjects to rate similarities between themselves and a professor, or between themselves and a soccer hooligan, and in another case to rate differences between themselves and so to get some sort of experimental control of the extent to which people were engaging with the professor or soccer hooligan stereotype. The other thing that they manipulated was whether when you think of think of the traits of a professor or a soccer hooligan, you might think of that as a category, or it might bring to mind a particular exemplar, like Einstein. And of course, that again might moderate the effect that you get from this priming manipulation. And to cut a long story short, what Leboeuf and Estes argued and found experimental support for was the idea that if you prime people to think of differences between themselves and Einstein, they will then get a strong boost to their performance on the general knowledge questions compared to when they think of similarities between themselves and a professor. And this is one of the experiments that they did, in which, as you can see, this is the general knowledge performance. It's way higher when people have previously thought of differences between themselves and Einstein versus similarities between themselves and a professor. Now, whether or not that quote, prediction makes sense, I don't think is really important here. I mean, I think intuitively you could have imagined it would be the other way around, but that was the rationale that they had, and they published a couple of experiments in which they got that kind of evidential support. So again, we tried doing that, and as you can see, not a hint of an effect, and once again, it's in the wrong direction here. So we've got, we've done similar attempts to follow up other studies in that literature. But one of the things that we, one of the things I want to sort of get across, I guess, in this talk is that there are positive things that you can do with null results. That's really, if there's one take-home message, I guess it would be that. And one positive thing that you can do is to try to think of some manipulation that you can build into your experiment to demonstrate that in your procedure with your participants, in the way that you're doing the experiments, you can get some manipulation of your outcome variable. And so we thought one plausible way of doing that would be to use monetary incentives on general knowledge performance. There is a literature, which I won't go into, showing that if you financially motivate people on laboratory sort of IQ test type materials, you do get, under the right circumstances, you can get effects. There's even evidence that if you go and pay school kids in American classrooms, their performance will improve. So we thought, well, what about if we have two groups here? So these participants just do the general knowledge test. They don't get any priming induction. If we reward one group for getting correct answers, will that actually affect their performance? If so, then at least we can demonstrate that we are able to get some sensitivity in our outcome measure. It's not just that we're totally incapable of getting any effects whatsoever. And so then we ran also the two groups that are, again, replication of the basic procedure. And yes, we could get an incentive effect on performance. That's significant at the 0.05 level. But again, we get no effect from the priming manipulation, although it's here in the right direction. Okay? So that's one of the sort of positive things that I think you can generally do when you're running into difficulty replicating an effect. Show that at least something will influence your outcome measure. And I'm going to show you a couple more examples of the sorts of things that you can extract from null results a little bit later. But basically, we've got a big series of experiments. I think it's about 9 experiments looking at the key claims in this literature, and none of those experiments reveal priming effects. So my claim basically is that despite the apparent size of this mini literature, it is reporting a series of false positive effects. What are we going to do about this? We obviously are engaged in experimental practices which are facilitating the reporting of results, whether it's these particular, this particular literature or the sort of John Barge type experiment, or generally across the field. We seem to be adopting methods in our research that are contributing to the reporting of some unreplicable findings. And so I want to spend a bit of time talking about, who or what's to blame in this, and what can we do about it. And many people before have talked about these things. I mean, I'm certainly not saying anything terribly original in these particular points, but I will demonstrate using our data set some of the things that can be done in a positive way. So one of the culprits is our statistical methodology and the fact that we treat null results as almost meaningless. In Fisherian statistics, as this nice quote illustrates, data exist for only one reason, and that's to allow you to disprove the null hypothesis. If you fail to disprove the null hypothesis, then you are no better off than you were before you did the experiment. And that, in a sense, is crazy. I mean, any set of data is providing you with evidence. It may not be terribly informative evidence, but it's evidence. And the idea of ignoring it because you fail to disprove the null hypothesis seems very extreme. People have all sorts of misconceptions which make their way into published research about what they're doing in the null hypothesis framework. So people have misconceptions, for example, about what p-values are. The biggest misconception is that people think that p-values are measures of the strength of evidence. If you get a p-value of 0.0001, are you getting stronger evidence for your effect than if the p-value is 0.05? No. P-values are not measures of evidence. I won't embarrass you by asking what the correct statistical interpretation of a p-value is, which is a question. We had a seminar here from Erik Jan Wagenmakers last year, and we had another one from Zoltan Dinej, who were talking about statistics, and everybody in the room, I think, pretty much had the wrong answer to that question. People say things like, it's the probability of the null being true, which is incorrect. P-value is not the probability of the null being true. We have peculiar practices which are nothing more than conventions. For instance, the cliff edge of 0.05, where something just on one side is great and publishable and gets you promoted and so on. Something just on the other side goes into your bin. I mean, ludicrous, really. Because the difference in the evidential value of those two things is negligible. As many people have argued, what we perhaps should be thinking much, much more about are effect sizes. And you can think about situations here where we focus on p-values when we would be much better off focusing on effect sizes. So you can do a huge high-powered experiment and get an effect that's just statistically significant at 0.05. But the size of that effect could be tiny. It's significant because you've got a very powerful experiment. Because the effect is tiny, it's probably of no practical value whatsoever. It's probably not of any theoretical value, but it gets published. On the other hand, you could do an underpowered experiment which fails to get a significant result, but actually yields quite a big effect, an effect that might, in practice, be much more meaningful. It might form the basis of a successful therapeutic intervention or something like that, but it's gone into your bin because it was on the wrong side of the 0.05 level. So one of the positive outcomes, I think, of a lot of this debate is recognition that there are alternatives to all this. I mean, effect size, concentration on the effect size is one very simple alternative. But I would just spend a minute talking about Bayesian statistics here, which treat the null and the experimental hypothesis as on a completely equal footing. And Bayesian approaches try to compute Bayes factors which represent the likelihood of a given set of data from an experiment if the null hypothesis was true, relative to the likelihood of getting that same set of data if the experimental hypothesis were true. Now, if this ratio is, say, 1/10, a small number, that's telling you that the data that you've got are much more likely given the experimental hypothesis than the null hypothesis. On the other hand, if this ratio is very large, say 10:1, then it would be the other way round. And it's extremely easy to compute extremely easy to compute Bayes factors nowadays. And this is what happens when we computed these statistics for all the experiments that we did. I haven't explained all of these. The details of these experiments don't matter at all. But these were the effect sizes that we obtained in these experiments. These are the t-values. They're all non-significant, and the associated p-value. If you just look at the column marked Cauchy here, this is calculating Bayes factors. There's two different ways of doing this, but Cauchy is the one that people tend to focus on. All of these numbers are greater than 1. What that means is that for every experiment, they provided more evidence for the null hypothesis than they did for the experimental hypothesis. And the more powerful an experiment is, the larger the sample size, the bigger the ratio. So you may remember that in experiment 4 we had a quite large sample of subject. You get an even bigger Bayes factor here, and that's because the sample size is very big. If you get a null result, that's more evidence for the null hypothesis than for the experimental hypothesis. There isn't a single case here where the evidence was more in favor of the experimental hypothesis, i.e. the hypothesis of a priming effect. And when you combine all these, you end up with a Bayes factor of 12. Now, one important thing to emphasize is that there's no cliff edge here. There's no value that you have to exceed, like a 0.05 value, in order for your result to be meaningful. All of these results are meaningful. But there is nonetheless a sort of convention that says Bayes factor between 1 and 3 is probably not much more than anecdotal evidence. When it gets between 3 and 10, that's getting quite substantial, and anything bigger than 10 is strong evidence. So our combined Bayes factor is quite a large number and quite powerful evidence for the null hypothesis. And remember that that is a statement I simply wouldn't be able to stand here and make if I was a null hypothesis statistical testing person. Right, who else is to blame? What about journal editors? Well, people have highlighted a number of problems in the way in which journals are operating now. Considerable interest in short, very snazzy articles with a very salient message, even though there may be no theory whatsoever in the paper. And we have journals nowadays like Psychological Science. I mean, it's a great journal, but it's probably in some sense contributing to this crisis that we're facing, because it's publishing very short articles. Short articles tend to have a small number of experiments in them. Small number of experiments means a higher likelihood of false positives. And researchers like Bertamini and Munafo have done proper statistical evidence about short articles versus longer articles and documented the fact that they inflate the false positive rate. Only about 1% of all findings in psychology are replicated. 1%. 1%. That's a staggering number. I mean, if you think that what we're trying to do is to create a body of knowledge that we can take out into the real world to improve people's lives and treat their conditions and whatever, we would want solid effects that we all know and believe in. 1% is just incredible. It says that most of the things that we do never get followed up and adequately documented and proven. The Stroop effect is, in that 1%. We all know that that's a real effect, but most things are not in that category whatsoever. Publication bias and the file drawer effect are consequences of this, because the journals don't like publishing failed replications. They just have an aversion to them, and so they go into people's filing cabinets. And that, in turn, means that what is in the published literature is a biased sample. If it's a biased sample, then you can't make anything from it. So how do you deal with things like publication bias? or how do you ask whether a field that you're looking at contains publication bias? Well, here again, there are now methods available, and we applied this method to our data. These are all the studies in that literature that I referred to previously, which have reported the very simple basic effect, professor prime, soccer prime, and an effect on general knowledge performance. Some of these involve things like professors versus cleaning ladies. So what I'm showing here is the sample size in each of these experiments and the observed effect size. Now, this is meant to be a subtle priming effect. So let's imagine that the priming effect is real, but it's a smallish effect, subtle effect. Let's say it is an effect, it's a true effect of size 0.2. Okay, over here. Now, what you can determine then is that an experiment like this one at the top, which had 11 participants per group, would have had a power of 0.12 to detect a true effect of size 0.2. That means if you did that experiment 100 times, on only 12 of those occasions would you get a statistically significant effect, even if the effect is true and real. It's an underpowered experiment. Yeah? Now the point is that if the literature contains a whole load of experiments like this, all with statistically significant results, then you can look at that literature and say that it must contain publication bias, because the likelihood of them all coming out with statistically significant results is very, very low. And that's what's shown here in this bottom column. So these are the power levels of all the experiments. You can see all these experiments are incredibly underpowered for getting small effects. If you add all of those up, you would expect that only 1.3 of these experiments should have got a statistically significant result. But in fact, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them did. Now, I'm not saying that this proves publication bias here. What I'm trying to illustrate is a tool for looking at publication bias. It is possible that there is a true priming effect in these experiments that is much bigger, say 0.8, in which case you would expect 7 or so papers to have got significant results, which is in the right ballpark. But the method is there, and people like Greg Francis are now using this method to look at small or not so small literatures and identify publication bias directly in the published results. So if too many successful experiments have been reported, given the power of those experiments, then that is strong evidence that they're biased sample of the experiments that have been done. One solution to this difficulty of publishing null results, that they all end up in people's file drawers, had been the creation of this very nice website by Bobby Spellman and Hal Pashler, Psych File Drawer. It's very interesting. Go and have a look at this. I asked Hal how many unique visits it had had, and I think it's had something like 70,000 visits in the last year. And all it does is it asks people to post brief details of any experiments that they've done where they were unable to replicate an expected effect. It's not emotive, it's not evaluative, it's just putting the evidence up there for others to go and look at and to take into account. And I should just mention that there are now 2 further failed Dijksterhuis and Van Nippenburg experiments on Psych File Drawer. So we're not alone in having difficulty getting that effect. We are to blame. We show error and bias in various ways, such as this. Bakker and Witschitz went through an enormous corpus of psychology papers, and they did effectively an automated search. And they were searching for things like this. Any time that there was a test result reported from a t-test or an ANOVA or a chi-squared test. And all they did is they looked at this and they asked, does the reported p-value match up with the t-value and the degrees of freedom? Okay? Now, of course, often people would just report p is less than 0.05 or p is greater than 0.05, in which case the likelihood of making an error you would think would be quite low. When people are reporting an exact p-value, then that's probably going to increase the likelihood of them making an error. But what do anybody like to guess what proportion of papers in this database contain errors? What sort of figure are we talking about?
5%.
5%. You're very close, Dave. It was only 55%. 18% of all the results contained errors. Reassuringly, Backett and Wichert showed that actually journals with higher impact factors have lower rates of errors. So what we regard as the better reviewing and scrutiny process of our top journals is indeed slightly better at weeding out these sorts of errors, but nonetheless the figures are alarmingly high. And of course there's genuine bias in here. These are not typos, because people are much more likely to make an error which makes a non-significant result significant and changes this theoretical evidence. There's been much discussion about things like researcher degrees of freedom. These are the things that people can tweak to get a significant result out of their data. You do an experiment where you have 4 dependent measures and you drop 3 of them and just report the one that came out right. There's a lovely example that I've just seen in the latest issue of the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, the same issue in which they're retracting 6 papers. One of the papers that they actually publish just reports a bunch of results from female subjects in the experiment. There's no a priori justification that that was going to be the analysis that they were going to do. They just report the female subjects. And of course, if you do that, you're inflating your false positive rate. Unwillingness to provide data is another source of error in what we're doing, because it doesn't allow others to scrutinize the reports that we make. Again, Backer and Wichert have looked at this, and they found that the majority of requests for data are either flatly declined, or the author says, I'll come back to you, and never does. The dog ate my data sort of responses. Questionable research practices or deliberate fraud obviously do play a role in this. Here are some data from a study by John et al. In which people responded anonymously and were motivated to be, to reveal the truth, motivated to a reasonable extent to be truthful. What proportion of people admitted that they fail always to report all of a study's dependent measures? What proportion of people reported rounding off p-values in favourable ways, or decided whether to exclude data after looking at the impact of doing so on the results? These are frightening levels of confession of this sort of bias. And lastly, let me finish off by just sort of pinning these things back to a kind of more theoretical issue. At the heart of a lot of these problems, not all of them by any means, a lot of these problems, in my view, is a false theory of human behaviour, in which we see ourselves, or psychologists see us, as reeds in the wind, being influenced by all these subtle environmental cues. Our conscious thoughts and intentions are not causal. They're a bit like the compass on a ship, which is sort of correlated with the movement of the ship, but doesn't cause it. And this view is, we're all is all around us in pop books about psychology and about the richness of unconscious processing. This is a false theory of human behaviour. I wouldn't deny that there are no instances of subtle unconscious processes or influences on behavior. But these are, if they exist at all, they exist under incredibly rarefied laboratory conditions over nanosecond timescales. There's virtually no evidence that these effects have any meaning in the real world. And I'll just end by making a comment about this industry around one particular example of unconscious influences, the IAT, the implicit association test. Thousands of hits on Web of Science for research using this particular technique. There have even been something like 10 papers published so far this year on the implicit association test. And I won't go into detail about the test, but it's a test that can be used to measure, for example, quotes implicit racial bias. And it's a reaction time test that involves congruent and incongruent trials. What is the evidence that attitudes, racial or otherwise, measured in the implicit association test are meaningful, that they have any relation to behavior? Answer, precisely none. There is no evidence that the IAT correlates with any real-world manifestation of bias, whether it's racial or in any other domain. So people have tried to do studies where you measure bias in, say, an interview context. Somebody's interviewing job applicants, and some are black and some are white, and you have some sort of measure of the interviewer's bias. And then you get them to do an IAT. And what do you find? Absolutely no relationship between these things. And yet, this technique is thrown out as being, showing a window onto our true unconscious attitudes and stereotypes. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much indeed, and look forward to your questions.